The morning sun cast long shadows across the famous black railings of Buckingham Palace. It was one of those perfect September days in London when the air felt crisp and fresh, and tourists from around the world gathered with their cameras ready. Among the crowd, children pressed their faces against the metal bars, hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty while their parents snapped endless photos of the magnificent building behind. Standing perfectly still at his post was Tommy Richardson, a 28-year-old member of the Queen's Guard. His red tunic was immaculate, every button polished to perfection. The famous black bearskin hat sat perfectly straight on his head, and his rifle stood at exactly the right angle beside him. To the hundreds of people walking past, Tommy looked like a statue come to life. But Tommy was far from being just a pretty decoration for tourists to photograph. Behind that stoic expression and motionless stance was a man with 6 years of intense military training. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before earning his place in this elite unit. Every muscle in his body was trained for combat, every reflex honed to perfection. The tourists saw a ceremonial guard, but what they were really looking at was a highly skilled soldier. The palace gates buzzed with activity as usual. Tour groups shuffled past, their guides pointing out historical facts about the building. Street performers entertained crowds just beyond the security perimeter. Vendors sold postcards and miniature guards to eager visitors. The familiar sounds of London traffic mixed with dozens of different languages as people from every corner of the globe gathered to experience this piece of British history. Tommy had been standing at his post since 6 that morning. It was now past noon, and he hadn't moved a single muscle except to blink. This wasn't just about tradition or show, it was about discipline, honor, and representing something bigger than himself. Every guard who stood at these gates understood the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. The other tourists had no idea what kind of training Tommy had endured to earn his position. The selection process was brutal. Out of hundreds of applicants, only the very best made it through. Physical fitness was just the beginning. Mental toughness, unwavering discipline, and the ability to remain calm under pressure were equally important. Tommy remembered the countless hours of drilling, the exhausting physical challenges, and the psychological tests designed to break weaker candidates. During his military service, Tommy had faced real danger. He knew what it felt like when bullets whistled past his head. He had carried wounded comrades to safety under enemy fire. He understood the difference between ceremonial duty and actual combat. But he also knew that his current role required the same level of alertness and readiness. As the afternoon crowd grew thicker, Tommy noticed the usual mix of respectful visitors and occasional troublemakers. Most people understood the significance of what they were witnessing. They kept a respectful distance, took their photos quietly, and moved on. Children would sometimes wave at him, their faces lighting up with wonder when he didn't wave back. Their parents would gently explain that the guard couldn't move or speak while on duty, but there were always a few who tried to test the limits. Some would make funny faces hoping to get a reaction. Others would ask silly questions or make loud comments about his appearance. Tommy had seen it all before. Part of his training specifically covered how to handle these situations with dignity and professionalism. The security team monitoring the area through dozens of cameras knew Tommy well. They had watched him handle difficult situations with remarkable composure. There was the time a drunk man tried to climb the fence, or when an overly enthusiastic tourist got too close and had to be politely redirected. Tommy never broke character, never lost his cool, never gave the troublemakers the satisfaction of a reaction. What most people didn't realize was how much effort it took to remain completely motionless for hours at a time. Every guard developed their own mental techniques for dealing with the physical and psychological challenges. Some focused on breathing exercises. Others mentally rehearsed military procedures or thought about their families back home. Tommy often used the time to observe the crowd, noting details and assessing potential security concerns without moving his eyes. The palace itself seemed to watch over Tommy as he stood guard. The massive stone building had witnessed centuries of British history. Kings and queens had walked through those doors. Important decisions that shaped the world had been made within those walls. Standing guard here wasn't just a job, it was participating in something much larger than any individual person. Tommy's colleagues respected him for his dedication and reliability. In 6 years of service, he had never broken protocol, never complained about difficult assignments, and never let personal problems affect his performance. His commanding officers knew they could count on him to represent the unit with honor. No matter what challenges arose, the equipment Tommy carried wasn't just for show either. His rifle was fully functional, though unloaded during ceremonial duties. He knew how to use every piece of gear he wore, from the bayonet at his side to the emergency radio hidden discreetly in his uniform. If a real security threat emerged, Tommy could transition from ceremonial guard to active soldier in seconds. As the day progressed, Tommy remained completely focused on his duties. He was aware of every person who approached his position, every movement in the crowd, every potential security concern. His training had taught him to process multiple streams of information simultaneously. While maintaining his motionless exterior, the tourists continued their endless parade past the palace gates. Most showed appropriate respect for the traditions they were witnessing. They understood that what they were seeing represented something important about British culture and history. The guards weren't just there for entertainment. They were symbols of duty, honor, and service to something greater than themselves, unknown to Tommy. About a mile away in a crowded pub, 6 university students were finishing their third round of drinks and making increasingly bold statements about what they planned to do when they reached the palace. But Tommy remained focused on his immediate surroundings, alert and ready for whatever the rest of his shift might bring. About 3 miles away from Buckingham Palace, in a crowded pub called the Crown and Anchor, 6 university students were deep into what had started as a simple afternoon drink. The pub was one of those typical London establishments with dark wooden beams, old photographs on the walls, and the smell of fish and chips hanging in the air. It was the kind of place where locals mixed with tourists, and conversations got louder as the afternoon wore on. The 6 friends had come to London for what they called their final adventure before graduating from Manchester University. They had been planning this trip for months, saving up money from part-time jobs and looking forward to exploring the capital city. What started as an innocent sightseeing trip was slowly turning into something entirely different. Danny was the unofficial leader of the group. At 22, he was the oldest and always seemed to be the one pushing boundaries. He had that kind of personality that drew people in but also got them into trouble. His friends often found themselves doing things they normally wouldn't do, just because Danny made it sound like a great idea. Today was no different. The group had already visited several famous London landmarks. They had taken the typical tourist photos at Big Ben, walked across Tower Bridge, and even paid the expensive entry fee to see the crown jewels. But with each pub they visited, their plans became more ambitious and their judgment became cloudier. "I'm telling you guys," Danny said, raising his pint glass, "those guards at the palace are just for show. They can't actually do anything if someone messes with them. It's all just tourism nonsense." His friend Ryan, a quiet engineering student who rarely spoke up, shook his head. "I don't know, man. I heard they're real soldiers. Like actual military guys." But Danny wasn't having any of it. "Come on, Ryan. Look at them on Instagram. They just stand there like statues while people take selfies. They're probably just actors or something. I bet they're not even allowed to move." A conversation continued as they ordered another round. Each drink seemed to make Danny's theories more elaborate and his friends more willing to listen. What had started as casual curiosity about the famous guards was becoming a challenge, a dare that none of them wanted to back down from. Ben, who was studying psychology, tried to be the voice of reason. "Even if they can't move, there's probably security cameras everywhere and real police officers nearby. We could get into serious trouble." But Danny had an answer for everything. "Security cameras? So what? We're just tourists having fun. What are they going to do? Arrest us for taking pictures? Besides, we're not going to hurt anyone." We're just going to test if they really can't react to anything. The other members of the group exchanged glances. There was Tom, who played rugby for the university team and was usually up for any physical challenge. There was Alex, the quiet one who went along with group decisions to avoid conflict. And finally, there was Chris, who had a reputation for getting into scrapes, but always managing to talk his way out of trouble. As the afternoon progressed, the pub filled with more people. Office workers were stopping by for after-work drinks. Tourists were taking breaks from sightseeing, and locals were settling in for their regular evening sessions. The noise level increased, and the students found themselves talking louder and more boldly about their plans. I saw a video online. Danny continued, pulling out his phone. This guy walked right up to a guard and started dancing in front of him. The guard didn't do anything, didn't even blink. It was hilarious. The video he showed wasn't quite what he described, but his friends were too influenced by alcohol to notice the details. They saw what Danny wanted them to see, a harmless prank that got a funny reaction from tourists without any real consequences. Tom, flexing his rugby-trained muscles, started getting interested. You really think they won't fight back? Even if someone pushes them? That's exactly what I'm saying, Danny replied confidently. They're trained to be like statues. They probably get fired if they react to anything. It's all about that British discipline and tradition stuff. The group's conversation was attracting attention from other people in the pub. Some older locals were shaking their heads, clearly disapproving of what they were hearing. But the students were too caught up in their own excitement to notice the warning looks. Ryan tried one more time to inject some sense into the conversation. Look, even if you're right about them not fighting back, what's the point? Why would we want to bother someone who's just doing their job? But his reasonable question was drowned out by Danny's increasingly elaborate plans. It's not about bothering anyone. It's about proving a point. Everyone thinks these guards are so tough and disciplined. I'm saying they're just part of a tourist show, and if we can prove it, imagine the video we could make. The mention of making a video got everyone's attention. In their social media-obsessed world, the idea of creating content that could go viral was incredibly appealing. They started imagining the likes, shares, and comments they could get from documenting their experiment with the Royal Guard. Alex, who had been quiet most of the afternoon, finally spoke up. What exactly are you suggesting we do? Danny leaned in closer, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret military strategy. We all approached the guard at the same time, from different angles. Then we all do something small, maybe just a little push or tap all at once. He won't be able to react to all of us simultaneously, and it'll prove that they really can't do anything. The plan sounded almost reasonable the way Danny explained it. He made it seem like a harmless experiment, rather than what it actually was, a coordinated assault on a member of the military. The alcohol had clouded their judgment enough that they couldn't see the serious legal and physical risks they would be taking. Ben tried one last time to talk sense into the group. What if you're wrong? What if they can fight back? What if we get arrested? But Danny had an answer ready. If I'm wrong, then we'll know, but I'm not wrong. Trust me on this one, guys. This is going to be legendary. As closing time approached, the six friends found themselves walking unsteadily toward the palace. Their afternoon of drinking had transformed them from innocent tourists into potential troublemakers, though they still saw themselves as harmless pranksters about to pull off the ultimate joke. The London streets seemed to spin slightly as they made their way through the evening crowds. None of them realized they were about to make the biggest mistake of their young lives. The evening air felt cooler as the 6 university students stumbled out of their fourth pub and made their way toward Buckingham Palace. The London streets were busier now, filled with people heading home from work and tourists enjoying the nightlife. Street lamps were starting to flicker on, casting long shadows across the pavement. Danny led the way, his confidence growing with each step. He kept looking back at his friends, making sure they were still committed to their plan. Remember, guys, this is going to be epic. We're about to prove something that nobody else has been brave enough to test. The closer they got to the palace, the more nervous some of the group became. Ryan kept checking his phone, probably hoping someone back home would call and give him an excuse to leave. But the peer pressure was too strong, and the alcohol was still affecting their judgment. As they turned the corner and saw the familiar black railings of Buckingham Palace ahead, the reality of what they were planning started to hit them. The palace looked more imposing in the evening light, more serious and official than it had seemed in the tourist photos they'd seen online. There were still plenty of people around, even at this hour. Couples were taking romantic evening strolls. Families were finishing up their sightseeing, and groups of friends were taking photos with the palace in the background. The students tried to blend in with the crowd, but their loud voices and unsteady walking made them stand out. Tommy Richardson was still at his post, exactly where he had been all day. His shift was supposed to end in an hour, but he showed no signs of fatigue. If anything, he seemed even more alert as the evening progressed. Years of military training had taught him that trouble often came when people least expected it. The security team monitoring the area had already noticed the group of students approaching. Through their network of cameras, they could see the 6 young men pointing toward the palace and talking animatedly among themselves. Their body language suggested they weren't just typical tourists taking photos, but the security officers had seen groups like this before. Young people, usually after drinking, would come to the palace with big plans to interact with the guards. Most of them lost their nerve when they actually got close and saw how serious and professional the guards really were. The security team decided to keep watching but didn't intervene yet. Danny and his friends positioned themselves about 50 feet away from Tommy's post, trying to look casual while they planned their approach. They were close enough now to see the guard clearly, and some of their earlier confidence started to waver. "Wow," whispered Tom, "he really doesn't move at all. He's been standing like that for who knows how long." Alex was starting to have second thoughts. "Maybe we should just take some normal photos and call it a day. This guy looks pretty serious." But Danny wasn't backing down. "That's exactly the point. He looks serious, but he can't do anything. It's all just an act. Watch this." Danny walked closer to Tommy's position, staying just outside the designated boundary area. He started making exaggerated gestures, waving his arms and pointing at the guard. "Hello there, Mr. Guard. Can you hear me? How about a smile for the camera?" Tommy remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His training had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation. He had learned to tune out distractions while remaining alert to real threats. Danny's amateur attempts at provocation were nothing compared to what Tommy had experienced during his military service. The other tourists in the area started to notice what was happening. Some pulled out their phones to record what they thought might become an interesting video. Others looked uncomfortable and started moving away from the area. A few parents quickly guided their children to a safer distance. Encouraged by the attention he was getting, Danny became bolder. "See, guys, I told you, he's like a robot. Completely programmed not to react." Ben tried to convince his friend to stop. "Danny, come on, you've made your point. Let's just go get some dinner and call it a night." But Danny was enjoying the spotlight. Too much to quit now. He started making silly faces at Tommy, jumping up and down and even doing a little dance. Each time the guard failed to react, Danny felt more vindicated in his theory. "This is incredible," he announced to his friends, and anyone else who was listening. "These famous British guards are just actors in costumes. They're not real soldiers at all." Tommy could hear every word Danny was saying, but his expression never changed. Inside, however, he was carefully assessing the situation. The young man was clearly intoxicated and showing off for his friends, but he hadn't crossed any serious lines yet. Tommy had dealt with hundreds of similar situations during his time on duty. Ryan was getting more uncomfortable by the minute. "Danny, seriously, let's just go. This isn't proving anything except that you can make noise in front of someone who's trained not to react." But Danny had moved beyond trying to get a reaction from the guard. Now he was performing for the growing crowd of onlookers and the cameras that were recording his every move. "You know what would really prove my point?" he said, turning to his friends with a mischievous grin. The security team was paying closer attention now. They could see that Danny's behavior was escalating, and they started moving personnel closer to the area. But they still hoped the situation would resolve itself without requiring intervention. Chris, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke up. "What are you thinking, Danny? Because the look in your eyes is making me nervous." Danny's plan was becoming clearer in his alcohol-clouded mind. "If this guard really can't react to anything, then it shouldn't matter what we do. As long as we're not actually hurting him, it's just a harmless test." The other students exchanged worried glances. They were starting to realize that Danny's harmless test might not be as innocent as he claimed. But they had come this far, and backing down now would mean admitting they were wrong to trust their friend's judgment. Tommy noticed the change in the group's energy. His military instincts told him that the situation was about to escalate. While he continued to maintain his position and composure, he mentally prepared for whatever might come next. He had been trained for this exact scenario, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. The evening crowd around the palace was getting thicker, and more people were starting to pay attention to the group of students and their increasingly bold behavior. Some tourists thought it was entertaining, while others looked concerned about what might happen next. Danny looked back at his 5 friends, his eyes bright with excitement and alcohol. "Okay, guys, here's what we're going to do. If everyone's ready, it's time to make history." The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace had shifted dramatically in the past few minutes. What started as typical tourist activity was now something much more tense. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the commotion Danny was making, and phones were being pulled out everywhere to record whatever was about to happen. Danny gathered his 5 friends into a tight circle, speaking in what he thought was a whisper, but was actually loud enough for nearby tourists to hear clearly. His plan was becoming more detailed and more dangerous by the minute, though he still convinced himself it was just harmless fun. "Listen carefully," Danny said, his eyes bright with alcohol and excitement. "We're going to spread out around the guard, all 6 of us from different angles. Then, on my signal, we all move in at the same time." Ryan's face went pale. "Move in how exactly? What are you planning to do?" Danny waved off his friend's concerns. "Nothing crazy, just a little test. Maybe a small push or a tap. Just to see if he really can't react when there's too much happening at once. Think about it, he can't watch." All of us simultaneously. Ben shook his head vigorously. "This is insane, Danny. That's not a test. That's assault." We could go to jail for this, but Danny had an answer for everything. "Assault? Come on, we're not going to hurt him. We're just proving a point about these fake ceremonial guards. Besides, look at all these people filming. If something goes wrong, there's plenty of evidence that we weren't trying to cause real harm." Tom, the rugby player, was torn between loyalty to his friend and his own growing doubts. "I don't know, mate. This feels like we're crossing a line we can't uncross." The security team monitoring the situation was no longer treating this as a routine tourist incident. Through their earpieces, officers were coordinating a response plan. They could see the students' body language becoming more aggressive and purposeful. Several plainclothes security personnel started moving closer to the area, trying to position themselves for quick intervention if needed. Tommy Richardson remained perfectly still at his post, but every sense was now on high alert. His military training had taught him to recognize the signs of an impending attack, and everything about this group's behavior was setting off alarm bells. While his face showed no emotion, his mind was running through response scenarios. The other tourists in the area were starting to sense that something serious was about to happen. Some began moving their children away from the scene, while others stayed to watch what they thought might be an interesting confrontation. A few concerned visitors approached nearby, police officers to report the suspicious behavior. Danny's plan was becoming more elaborate as he spoke. "Alex, you take the left side. Chris, go around to the right. Tom, you position yourself behind him. Ben and Ryan, you guys come in from the front with me. When I give the signal, and I mean the exact moment I say now, we all move in together." Alex was shaking his head. "This is completely mental, Danny. What if you're wrong about him not being able to fight back? What if he's actually trained for combat? He's not, Danny insisted, though his voice carried less certainty than before. Look at him. He's been standing there like a statue all day. These guards are all show, no substance. It's just British. Pageantry for the tourists. The crowd around them was growing restless. Some people were starting to shout warnings, telling the students to leave the guard alone. A few tourists who understood what was being planned started calling out to security officers, pointing urgently toward the group. Ryan made one final attempt to talk sense into his friend. Danny, listen to me. Even if you're right about him not fighting back, we're being filmed by dozens of people. This will be all over social media in minutes. Our families will see this. Our university will see this. Is proving a point really worth ruining our futures? For just a moment, Danny seemed to hesitate. The weight of his friend's words cut through some of the alcohol-induced confidence. But then he looked around at all the cameras pointed in their direction, at the crowd waiting to see what would happen, and his pride took over. It's too late to back out now, he said firmly. Everyone's watching. If we chicken out, we'll look like complete idiots. Besides, I'm right about this. Trust me. The security officers were now close enough to intervene, but they were hoping the situation would de-escalate on its own. They had protocols to follow, and physically restraining the students before they actually did something would be difficult to justify legally. But they were ready to move at the first sign of actual aggression. Tommy could see the security personnel positioning themselves around the area. He knew backup was close, but he also knew that if the students followed through on their plan, he would need to handle the initial moments on his own. His training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. Multiple attackers approaching simultaneously. Ben made one last desperate plea. Guys, please, let's just walk away. We can still salvage this situation if we leave right now. Nobody has to get hurt, and we won't get arrested. But Danny was beyond reasoning now. The combination of alcohol, peer pressure, and the attention from the crowd had created a perfect storm. Stop being such a coward, Ben. This is happening whether you're in or out. The other 5 friends found themselves at a crossroads. They could either abandon their friend and face his anger and accusations of cowardice, or they could follow through with a plan that was becoming more obviously dangerous by the minute. The bonds of friendship and the fear of being excluded from the group proved stronger than their common sense. Fine, said Tom reluctantly. But if this goes wrong, I'm blaming you for the rest of my life. Danny grinned with satisfaction. It won't go wrong. Trust the plan. The students began to spread out around Tommy's position, trying to look casual as they moved into their assigned positions. The crowd noticed immediately what was happening, and the tension in the air became almost unbearable. An elderly British gentleman in the crowd called out loudly, "You boys need to stop this nonsense right now." That's a real soldier you're messing with. But his warning fell on deaf ears. Danny was committed to his course of action, and his friends were too caught up in the group dynamics to back out now. Tommy watched the students positioning themselves through his peripheral vision. He counted 6 potential attackers, noted their approximate positions, and mentally prepared his response. Years of combat training kicked in as he evaluated threats and planned his defensive strategy. The moment of decision was rapidly approaching, and everyone present seemed to sense it. The evening air felt electric with tension as the 6 university students moved into their positions around Tommy Richardson's guard post. What had started as a simple afternoon of tourist fun was now about to become something none of them would ever forget. The crowd around Buckingham Palace seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Danny positioned himself directly in front of Tommy, close enough to see the perfect details of the guard's red uniform. The brass buttons gleamed under the palace lights, and every thread seemed to be in its exact place. For the first time all evening, Danny got a really good look at the man he was planning to test. What he saw should have made him reconsider everything. Tommy wasn't just wearing a costume, he was a soldier in every sense of the word. His posture wasn't just ceremonial. It was the stance of someone who had been trained for combat. His eyes though looking straight ahead seemed to miss nothing. His jaw was set with determination, and there was something about his overall presence that spoke of real strength and discipline, but Danny had gone too far to back down now. The alcohol in his system, combined with the pressure of performing in front of a growing crowd, pushed him forward despite the warning signs his brain was trying to process. Alex had moved to Tommy's left side, about 10 feet away. His hands were shaking slightly and he kept looking around nervously. He could see security personnel in the distance, and their presence made him realize just how serious this situation was becoming. "This is really happening," he whispered to himself, hardly believing they had come this far. On Tommy's right side, Chris was trying to look casual while positioning himself for Danny's planned coordinated approach. He kept checking his phone, probably hoping for a text message or call that would give him an excuse to leave. But no rescue was coming, and he found himself committed to a plan he was increasingly sure was a terrible mistake. Tom, the rugby player, had positioned himself behind Tommy's post. From this angle, he could see how perfectly still the guard remained, despite being surrounded by potential threats. It was actually impressive, and Tom found himself gaining respect for the discipline required to maintain such composure. But he was also committed to supporting his friends. Even if he was having serious doubts, Ben and Ryan flanked Danny at the front, both looking pale and nervous. Ben kept glancing toward the palace gates, probably calculating how quickly they could run if things went wrong. Ryan was staring at Tommy's face, searching for any sign that the guard was aware of what was about to happen. The security team watching through their cameras could see everything unfolding. The lead officer spoke quietly into his radio. 6. Subjects now in position around guard post 3. Recommend immediate intervention. But the response came back that they needed to wait until an actual assault occurred before physically intervening. The legal requirements were clear. They couldn't arrest people for simply standing near a guard. Tommy's military training was now in full operation. Without moving his head, he had catalogued the exact position of each potential attacker. He knew that Alex on his left was the most nervous and least likely to follow through with real aggression. Chris on his right seemed distracted and uncommitted. The three in front were the primary threat, with Danny clearly being the leader and instigator. The crowd around the palace had grown significantly. Word was spreading through social media that something was about to happen at Buckingham Palace, and people were gathering to witness whatever was coming next. Phones were raised everywhere, ready to capture what many suspected would be a significant confrontation. A mother with 2 young children pushed through the crowd, trying to get her family to safety. "Come on, kids," she said urgently. "We need to move away from here." Other families followed her example, creating a ripple effect as more sensible people decided they didn't want to be near whatever was about to unfold. But just as many people moved closer, drawn by curiosity and the modern compulsion to record dramatic events, a group of teenagers positioned themselves where they could get the best camera angles. A tourist from Japan was live streaming the scene to his followers back home. An elderly couple from Scotland was trying to decide whether they should call for help or trust that the authorities had everything under control. Danny raised his hand slightly, preparing to give the signal that would change everything. His heart was racing, though he tried to convince himself it was from excitement rather than fear. "Remember, guys," he called out, just loud enough for his friends to hear, "all at once. Quick and coordinated. Just a little push to prove the point." Tommy heard every word clearly. In his mind, he was no longer standing guard at a tourist attraction. He was a soldier facing multiple attackers, and his training told him exactly how to respond. The fact that they were young and intoxicated wouldn't matter if they actually followed through with their plan. An assault was an assault, regardless of the attacker's intentions or level of preparation. The palace itself seemed to loom larger in the evening light, as if the centuries of British history contained within its walls were watching to see how this modern challenge to royal dignity would be handled. The building had witnessed wars, revolutions, and countless changes in the world, but the tradition of the guards had remained constant through it all. Ben made one final attempt to stop what was about to happen. "Danny, please look at his face. Really look at him." Does that look like someone who can't defend himself? Danny glanced at Tommy's face, and for a split second he saw what his friend was talking about. There was something in the guard's expression, not fear or uncertainty, but the calm readiness of someone who was prepared for exactly this situation. It was the look of a professional who had faced real danger before and knew how to handle it, but the moment of clarity passed quickly. Danny had invested too much in his theory about the guards being powerless. He had convinced his friends, drawn a crowd, and built up expectations. Backing down now would mean admitting he had been wrong about everything, and his pride wouldn't allow that. "It's time," Danny announced, his voice carrying across the area despite his attempt to speak quietly. "On my count, 3. The security officers tensed, ready to move the instant the students made contact with the guard. The crowd seemed to lean forward collectively, phones recording from dozens of angles. Tommy's muscles prepared to explode into action, his years of combat training ready to take over. 1. Danny continued, his hand moving down toward Tommy's chest as his 5 friends reluctantly prepared to follow through with the plan that would change all their lives. Forever. The word "now" echoed across the palace courtyard like a starting gun at a race. In that instant, everything changed from anticipation to action. 6 university students, fueled by alcohol and terrible judgment, launched themselves toward Tommy Richardson from multiple directions, convinced they were about to prove their theory about ceremonial guards being powerless. Danny led the charge from the front, his hands reaching toward Tommy's chest with what he thought would be a simple push. In his alcohol-clouded mind, he expected the guard to remain statue-like, unable to react to the coordinated attack. He imagined himself proving his point in front of dozens of cameras, becoming the guy who exposed the truth about British royal guards, but reality hit differently than Danny's expectations. The moment the first hand made contact with his uniform, Tommy Richardson transformed from ceremonial statue to combat soldier in a split second that seemed to stretch like slow motion. For everyone watching, years of military training, honed through real combat situations in Afghanistan, took over his body and mind. Tommy's first movement was so quick that many people in the crowd missed it entirely. His right elbow shot backward with surgical precision, catching Tom, who had approached from behind, square in the chest. The rugby player, despite his athletic build and strength training, crumpled instantly. The blow knocked the wind out of him completely, and he staggered backward, gasping for air before falling to his knees. At almost the same moment, Tommy's left arm swept sideways in a controlled but devastating arc. Alex, who had been approaching from the left side with obvious reluctance, found himself caught completely off guard by the speed and power of the response. The guard's forearm connected with Alex's shoulder, spinning him around and sending him stumbling into the metal railings of the palace fence. He, who had initiated the attack, suddenly found himself face to face with someone entirely different from the motionless statue he thought he was dealing with. Tommy's eyes, which had been staring straight ahead for hours, were now locked directly onto his with an intensity that made Danny's blood run cold. This wasn't a ceremonial performer. This was a trained soldier who had just been assaulted before Danny could even process what was happening. Tommy's hand shot out and grabbed the front of his jacket. Using Danny's own forward momentum against him, Tommy executed a textbook defensive maneuver that sent the student spinning to his left and crashing into Ben, who was trying to approach from the side. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. But for the people watching, it felt like watching a choreographed fight scene from an action movie. Except this was completely real, and the consequences were immediate and serious. Chris, who had been approaching from Tommy's right side, saw what was happening to his friends and tried to stop his own approach. But momentum and panic made him stumble forward anyway, putting him directly in the path of Tommy's next defensive move. A quick controlled push sent Chris sprawling across the pavement, his phone flying from his hand and skittering across the stone surface. Ryan, the engineering student who had been reluctant from the beginning, found himself frozen in place as he watched his friends being systematically and efficiently neutralized. His brain finally caught up with what his gut had been telling him all Along, they had made a terrible, terrible mistake. The crowd erupted in gasps, screams, and shouts. Some people were cheering for the guards' impressive display of defensive skills, while others were calling for medical help for the students. Phones captured everything from multiple angles, ensuring that this moment would be preserved forever. On social media, Tommy's response had been perfectly calibrated. He used exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat without causing permanent injury. His military training had taught him the difference between stopping an attack and unnecessarily harming attackers. Every move was defensive. Controlled and professional, the security officers who had been positioned around the area rushed forward immediately. They had witnessed the entire incident and could see clearly that Tommy had been assaulted by multiple attackers simultaneously. Their job now was to secure the scene and ensure no further escalation occurred. Ben, who had been knocked down when Danny crashed into him, looked up from the pavement with a mixture of shock and dawning realization. The ceremonial guard they had thought was helpless was now standing calmly in his original position, straightening his uniform as if nothing had happened. His breathing wasn't even elevated. Despite having just defended himself against 6 attackers, Tom was still on his knees, trying to catch his breath after the elbow strike to his chest. He kept looking up at Tommy with something approaching. Respect, finally understanding what they had really been dealing with. This wasn't someone playing a role. This was a professional soldier who had simply been doing his job when they decided to assault him. Alex was leaning against the palace railings, holding his shoulder and trying to process what had just happened. The impact with Tommy's forearm had been like running into a steel beam. There was no malicious intent in the guard's response, just efficient, professional neutralization of a threat. Danny was perhaps the most shocked of all. His entire theory about the guards being powerless had been destroyed in about 3 seconds. As he lay on the pavement, looking up at Tommy, who had already returned to his ceremonial stance, he realized how completely wrong he had been about everything. The crowd began to understand what they had just witnessed. This wasn't a tourist attraction entertaining visitors. This was a highly trained military professional who had just demonstrated exactly why royal guards were respected around the world. Their discipline wasn't weakness. It was strength under control. Chris slowly picked himself up from where he had fallen, retrieved his cracked phone, and looked around at his friends scattered across the palace courtyard. Not one of them had managed to prove Danny's theory. Instead, they had all been efficiently and professionally handled by someone who clearly knew exactly what he was doing. Ryan, still standing in his original position, hadn't even been touched. Tommy's training had allowed him to assess that Ryan wasn't fully committed to the attack and posed the least immediate threat. The precision of that judgment, made in split seconds during a chaotic situation, demonstrated the level of professional skill they had foolishly challenged. As the security officers began gathering the students together, Tommy Richardson calmly adjusted his red tunic, checked that his bearskin hat was properly positioned, and returned his gaze to the distance. To anyone just arriving at the scene, he looked exactly like he had before the incident, a perfectly disciplined ceremonial guard standing at attention, but everyone who had witnessed the previous minute knew better now. They had seen what real military training looked like when put into action. The aftermath of the confrontation unfolded quickly and with the kind of efficiency that only comes from well-trained professionals who have dealt with similar situations before. Within seconds of Tommy's defensive response, the entire air around his guard post was swarming with security personnel, police officers, and medical staff who seemed to appear from nowhere. The 6 university students found themselves in very different positions than they had been just moments earlier. What started as their confident plan to prove a point had ended with all of them scattered across the palace courtyard, nursing both physical injuries and wounded pride. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in as uniformed officers approached each of them. Danny, who had been so certain about his theory just minutes before, was now sitting on the cold stone pavement trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. His jacket was torn from where Tommy had grabbed it, and his confidence had completely evaporated. He kept looking up at the guard, who had returned to his perfect ceremonial stance as if nothing had happened. "This can't be real," Danny muttered to himself, but the aching in his ribs from where he had hit the ground told him otherwise. The alcohol that had fueled his bravado was wearing off, replaced by a growing sense of dread about what was going to happen next. Tom was still struggling to catch his breath properly. The precision of Tommy's elbow strike had been incredible, just enough force to stop him completely without causing permanent damage. As someone who played rugby at university level, Tom thought he understood physical confrontation. But this had been something entirely different. This was professional-level combat skills applied with surgical precision. A paramedic knelt down beside Tom, checking his breathing and asking if he felt any sharp pains in his chest. "Just winded," Tom managed to say, though he was secretly amazed that the damage wasn't worse. He realized now that Tommy could have seriously injured him if he had wanted to, but had instead used exactly the right amount of force to neutralize the threat. Alex was leaning against the palace railings, rotating his shoulder carefully to assess the damage. The security officer talking to him was surprisingly professional and calm, explaining that he would need to be checked by medical personnel before being formally arrested. Alex couldn't stop staring at Tommy, who looked exactly the same as he had when they first arrived hours earlier. "How is he just standing there like nothing happened?" Alex asked the officer. "We just attacked him, and he's back to being a statue." The officer, a veteran of many years working palace security, smiled slightly. "That's what real discipline looks like, son. That guard has been trained to handle situations like this and return to duty immediately. What you just experienced was a professional soldier doing his job." Chris had managed to retrieve his phone, though the screen was badly cracked from its impact with the pavement. As he examined the damage, he realized that even if the phone still worked, he definitely didn't want to post any videos of what had just happened. This wasn't the kind of content that would make them look cool or clever. It was evidence of the worst decision they had ever made. Ben was sitting on the ground nearby, holding his head in his hands. He had seen the whole thing coming and had tried to warn his friends, but peer pressure and loyalty had kept him from walking away when he should have. Now he was facing the same consequences as everyone else, despite his reluctance to participate. Ryan, who had been the most reluctant from the beginning, was the only one who hadn't been physically handled by Tommy. He stood exactly where he had been when Danny gave the signal, too shocked to move. A police officer approached him gently, recognizing that this particular student seemed less involved than the others. "Were you part of this?" the officer asked, not unkindly. Ryan nodded slowly. "I was supposed to be, but I couldn't do it. When I saw what was happening to my friends, I realized how stupid this whole thing was." The crowd that had gathered to watch the incident was buzzing with excitement and discussion. Many people were reviewing the videos they had recorded, amazed by what they had just witnessed. The general consensus among the observers was admiration for Tommy's professional response and shock at the student's poor judgment. An elderly British gentleman who had tried to warn the students earlier approached one of the security officers. "That guard handled himself beautifully," he said with obvious pride. "Showed those young fools exactly what real British military training looks like." A family from Australia had been watching the whole thing unfold. The father was explaining to his teenage son what they had just seen. "That's the difference between playing soldier and being a soldier, mate. That guard knew exactly what to do and did it perfectly." Meanwhile, Tommy Richardson continued his duty as if the interruption had never occurred. His breathing was normal, his posture was perfect, and his eyes were fixed straight ahead in the traditional manner. To anyone who hadn't witnessed the previous few minutes, he looked exactly like what tourists expected to see, a disciplined, ceremonial guard maintaining his post. But the people who had watched the confrontation knew better now. They had seen what lay beneath the ceremonial exterior: years of rigorous training, real combat experience, and the kind of professional competence that could neutralize multiple attackers while maintaining complete control and restraint. The security team was efficiently processing the scene. Each student was being individually questioned and assessed for injuries. The incident had been captured from multiple angles by both security cameras and tourist phones, providing clear evidence of what had occurred and Tommy's appropriate defensive response. One of the senior security officers approached Tommy's position and spoke quietly to him. "Everything all right, Richardson?" Without moving his head or breaking his ceremonial stance, Tommy replied in a low voice that only the officer could hear. "All secure, sir." Situation neutralized with minimal force required. The officer nodded approvingly. Textbook response. "Carry on." The medical team had finished their assessment of the students. None of them had sustained serious injuries, which was a testament to Tommy's skill and restraint. They were dealing with bruises, soreness, and damaged pride, but nothing that required hospital treatment. Danny was helped to his feet by a police officer, who began explaining his rights and the charges he would be facing. As the reality of his situation became clear, Danny kept glancing at Tommy, finally understanding just how wrong he had been about everything. The 6 friends who had arrived at the palace, full of confidence and bad ideas, were now facing arrest, criminal charges, and the humiliation of having their poor judgment broadcast to the world through dozens of phone videos. Their harmless prank had turned into a life-changing mistake that would follow them for years to come. As they were led away from the scene, each of them took one last look at Tommy Richardson, still standing perfectly at attention at his post. He had returned to being the ceremonial guard that tourists expected to see, but they would never forget the glimpse they had gotten of the highly trained soldier underneath the red uniform. 3 months after that fateful evening at Buckingham Palace, the consequences of those few minutes had rippled through 6 young lives in ways none of them could have imagined. What started as a drunken dare had become a harsh lesson in reality that would shape their futures forever. Danny sat in the defendant's dock at Westminster Magistrates' Court, wearing his only decent suit and trying to look as respectful as possible. His lawyer had warned him that assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard was a serious offense that the courts took very seriously. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, had listened to the evidence with obvious disapproval. "Mr. Morrison," the judge said, looking directly at Danny, "you were clearly the ringleader in this incident. Your actions showed complete disrespect for both a serving member of our armed forces and the traditions of this country." The courtroom was packed with journalists, curious members of the public, and the families of all 6 students. Danny's parents sat in the front row, their faces showing a mixture of disappointment and worry. His mother had been crying intermittently. Throughout the hearing, the video evidence from that night had been played multiple times during the trial. Each viewing made Danny's actions look worse and Tommy's response look more professional. The contrast was stark: 6 drunk young men attacking a disciplined soldier who defended himself with minimal necessary force. "You will serve 6 months in prison," the judge continued, "followed by 2 years of community service. Additionally, you are banned for life from all royal properties and grounds." Danny's shoulders slumped as the reality hit him. 6 months in prison meant missing his final semester at university. His degree would be delayed, his job prospects damaged, and his reputation permanently stained. The video of the incident had gone viral on social media, making him recognizable to millions of people as that idiot who attacked the Royal Guard. His 5 friends received lighter sentences but still faced serious consequences. Tom got 3-month suspended sentence and 200 hours of community service. His rugby scholarship was immediately terminated when the university saw the video. The team captain who had represented his county was now known as one of the students stupid enough to assault a royal guard. Alex received a similar suspended sentence in community service. His engineering degree was in jeopardy as several potential employers had already contacted the university saying they wouldn't consider hiring anyone involved in the incident. The attack on a serving soldier didn't sit well with companies that worked on defense contracts. Ben and Ryan, who had shown the most reluctance during the incident, received the lightest sentences, heavy fines, and community service. But even they faced consequences from their university. The student newspaper had run a front-page story about the incident, and they found themselves ostracized by many of their classmates. Chris faced additional charges because his damaged phone had contained messages planning the attack, which prosecutors used as evidence of premeditation. His sentence included mandatory alcohol counseling and anger management classes. The incident had become a case study in how quickly a bad decision could destroy promising futures. All 6 students had been on track to graduate with good degrees from a respected university. Now they were dealing with criminal records, damaged reputations, and uncertain prospects. The viral video had taken on a life of its own online. It had been viewed millions of times across various platforms, spawning countless memes and reaction videos. Most of the comments were harshly critical of the students and praising Tommy's professional response. The incident had become a symbol of entitled youth meeting disciplined professionalism. Tommy Richardson, meanwhile, had been commended for his textbook handling of the situation. His commanding officers praised his restraint, precision, and immediate return to duty. The incident had actually enhanced his reputation within the military community. A month after the court case, Tommy was promoted to sergeant major in recognition of his exemplary service. During the promotion ceremony, his commanding officer specifically mentioned the Palace incident as an example of how a professional soldier should respond to unexpected situations. Sergeant Major Richardson demonstrated exactly the kind of disciplined response we expect from our guards, the officer said. He neutralized multiple attackers while using minimal force, protected himself and the public, and immediately returned to his ceremonial duties. This is the standard we strive for. Tommy's family had watched the viral video with a mixture of pride and concern. His father, a retired Army veteran, understood exactly what skills his son had displayed. "You did everything right," he told Tommy. "Those boys learned a lesson they'll never forget, and you taught it to them without seriously hurting anyone." The incident had also sparked broader discussions about respect for military personnel and the consequences of viral social media culture. Many commentators pointed out how the students' desire to create viral content had led them to make catastrophically poor decisions. Universities across the country began using the incident as a cautionary tale in orientation programs. This is what happens when alcohol, peer pressure, and social media combine with poor judgment. Became a common theme in student safety presentations. Danny's time in prison was harder than he had expected. Other inmates quickly recognized him from the viral video, and many had little sympathy for someone who had attacked a soldier. He spent most of his sentence in protective custody for his own safety during his incarceration. Danny had plenty of time to think about the chain of decisions that had led him there. He wrote letters to Tommy Richardson apologizing for his actions, though the prison authorities advised him that the letters probably wouldn't be delivered for security reasons. The university ultimately allowed all 6 students to complete their degrees, but with permanent notations on their academic records about the criminal convictions. Career counselors warned them that they would face questions about the incident in job interviews for years to come. When Danny was finally released from prison, he found a world that hadn't forgotten his moment of viral infamy. Job applications were rejected as soon as employers Googled his name. The video would be the first thing anyone found when searching for him online. He eventually found work in a warehouse, far from the career in business he had originally planned. His coworkers recognized him occasionally, but most were decent enough not to bring it up directly. Still, he could see the recognition in their eyes and knew what they were thinking. The incident had taught all 6 young men harsh lessons about consequences, respect, and the permanence of viral videos. What seemed like a harmless prank in their alcohol-clouded judgment had resulted in criminal records, damaged careers, and public humiliation that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Tommy Richardson continued his distinguished military career, eventually becoming an instructor who trained other guards. He often used the Palace incident as a teaching example, showing new recruits how to respond to complex situations with appropriate force and immediate return to duty. The viral video remained online, a permanent reminder of what happens when foolish decisions meet professional competence. For millions of viewers around the world, it became a symbol of why certain traditions and institutions command respect and why that respect exists for very good reasons. Years later, the 6 students had learned to live with the consequences of those few minutes at Buckingham Palace. But none of them ever forgot the lesson they learned from Tommy Richardson. That behind every symbol of tradition and ceremony stands real people with real skills, earned through dedication, training, and sacrifice.